Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to Bible Study Live. I'm so glad that we're finally able to get to do this. I know that for those of you who were trying to join us last month, we were having some technical difficulties. So we're glad to be able to do the passage and kind of look at Exodus 3, which is what we had planned to do last month. Before we begin, feel free to, first of all, thank you all for being here. Feel free to say hello in the chat, and we'll feel free to engage with us in the chat and as we go on. And we'll start with our introductions, and I'll introduce myself, and then we can pass it around. Hello, everyone. My name is Micah Melody. I'm the Director of Community Engagement here at TMC. Who would like to introduce yourself next?
Hi, I am Mish. I am the Director of Operations here at TMC. And I'm nervous because this is my first time at a Bible study live. So be kind to me.
We're so glad to have you, Mish. I'm Peter. I'm the Development and Communications Coordinator here at TMC.
Well, yes, Mish, we're so glad to have you. And I think this is one of the wonderful things about Bible Study Live is this is just it's a place where our community can come and like share our thoughts and ideas. And so we're so glad to have you. I see we have Jeannie in the chat as well as Carolyn. Feel free to say hello if anyone else is there as well. Well, if you've been with our Bible Study Lives or this is your first time, generally what we do is we kind of walk through, we'll read each piece of the text a piece at a time, and then we'll have a moment to just share different insights and observations and questions we have about the text. So feel free to have your Bible out or just like listen as we read along. And so if you have observations or questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We generally have a little bit of a delay on our streams. So we may not get to see your question right away because it takes a little bit of time for the stream to catch up sometimes. But we will respond to you as soon as we can. So before we begin with reading the first section of Exodus 3, Mish, would you like to give us a little bit of a background on the text?
Yeah, sure. Exodus 3, first things first, we picked it out because we like the stories in Exodus, but they always give us so many questions, or at least me. I struggle a lot with reading Exodus stuff. But right before in chapter 1 and 2, the main characters are being introduced. And if you've ever seen Prince of Egypt, this is the story, right? So Moses is adopted in chapter 2 by the daughter of Pharaoh, after Pharaoh has this decree to go after all the Israelite babies. So, right away there, one of those moments they were like, oh, that's a pretty dark passage right there. So Moses grows up in court, but at some point he grows up to be a prince, and he sees a fellow Israelite being tortured by an enslaver, and he kills him, and everybody kind of turns on him, and he runs away. And he runs away to Midian, which we hear a little bit from before in scripture. Like the Midianites are technically the descendants of Abraham, but they're never really considered God's people. It's another one of those things that is uncomfortable to read, if you will. But he meets Zipporah there, which becomes his wife. And as he is in Midian, um, he encounters God, and that's where the story begins right now.
Perfect. Thank you, Mish. Yeah, and so we're going to take it a little chunk at a time. And so we're going to start in verse 1. We're going to read verses 1 through 6 first. Peter, would you like to read that?
Yeah, I can do that.
Also, feel free to, what version are you reading from?
I'm reading from the Common English Bible.
Awesome.
So I'm going to read Exodus 3, verses 1 through 6. Moses was taking care of the flock for his father-in-law Jethro, Midian's priest. He led his flock out to the edge of the desert, and he came to God's mountain called Horeb. The Lord's messenger appeared to him in a flame of fire in the middle of a bush. Moses saw that the bush was in flames, but it didn't burn up. Then Moses said to himself, "Let me check out this amazing sight and find out why the bush isn't burning up." When the Lord saw that he was coming to look, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." Moses said, "I'm here." Then the Lord said, "Don't come any closer. Take off your sandals because you are standing on holy ground." He continued, "I am the God of your father, Abraham's God, Isaac's God, and Jacob's God." Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God.
Thanks, Peter. Well, yeah, in the first few verses, also, if anyone else is reading from a different translation, feel free to put that in chat. It's always interesting to see the different translations folks are using, and as well as like any translation differences. I already spotted a really interesting phrasing. I'm in the NRSV, the updated version, and in verse 2, it says, "The bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed." And I just love that image of blazing, like this like massive fire. So feel free to add any observations you have about translation differences. What kind of thoughts do you all have on the text? Feel free to put them in the chat. Mish, do you have any kind of first observations that you have about any of the burning bush or this kind of call of Moses?
Yeah. Yeah, first, like so many questions. Every time I read this, growing up Jewish and going to Orthodox school, we read these stories and we were expected to memorize them. But as I was reading through this, I'm like, who is talking here? That was the first thing. It's like, is it a messenger or is it God? Like, I think it's in verse 2. I read from the JPS for the records, a Jewish publication. A messenger of God appeared to Moses, to him in a blazing fire. Mine also says blazing, out of a bush. So it's first a messenger, and then later on, it says, God says. So I was like, what are your thoughts on it? Like, what's going on there?
That's so interesting. I know, like thinking about like it reminds me of other places in the Hebrew scriptures where there is like this confusion, like it's a little bit ambiguous of whether or not
Yeah.
who is speaking. I'm thinking of when the messenger slash God comes and visits Abraham and
Yeah,
promising
Genesis 18,
in
right?
Genesis 18, there is this like, oh, is it God speaking? Is it like a divine messenger? Is there a difference? What is going on here? Who are the three? Like, there's like multiple people involved. So what is happening? So yeah, it's a very interesting question. What are your thoughts, Peter?
Yeah, that does kind of pop up throughout scripture, doesn't it? Of like, um, yeah, people kind of speaking on behalf of God or in God's voice, and like what that means. Um, yeah, I mean, I like the image of like like several different people representing God, and that's often the icon that's portrayed as the Trinity, right? Is the like visitors who visited Abraham, but the fact that God is can speak with many voices is always kind of interesting to me, and maybe it kind of shows that.
Yeah, almost feels like it's one of those things where it's like we try to imagine it's God is beyond comprehension in that way. So
Mhm.
like there is an interesting kind of nature of that feels kind of this elusiveness that's kind of being even linguistically folded in here of some sort.
Hmm.
Um,
Right. Yeah, I also find it's funny because like the messenger already appeared to Moses, but Moses is like, I gotta check this out, guys. It just sounds hilarious to me. But what I also like, what y'all say about the burning bush, there's tons of Jewish scholars that write specifically about the burning bush. I think Rabban Gamliel is my favorite. He's one of those Yolden rabbis, but he specifically focuses on that a thorn bush is something that we never pay attention to. Yet in a thorn bush, God is speaking to Moses. So even something that we think is thorny and something that we would never come close to is still not devoid of God's spirits.
Mm,
And when I read that, I teared up a little bit. I teared up a little bit. That was beautiful.
that's
No, I really
really
like that.
powerful. Sorry, Peter.
No, I agree. I really like that. Like I'd never thought about the fact that it says it's a thorn bush before. Yeah, and the fact that we experience that as like something to be avoided, and then that's what God speaks to us through.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I'm noticing some comments in the chat. I see from Carolyn. I find it interesting that Moses was instructed to take off his sandals, but then deciding to hide his face was his own decision. And it makes me wonder about how we express reverence. Well, that's a really wonderful question. And I'm actually like, I know some of like both Misha and Peter, you both kind of had some thoughts on kind of the significance of bare feet and like taking off sandals. And I'm wondering if you wanted to share some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I know that like we typically think of taking off shoes as being a sign of like reverence or like being in the presence of something holy, and I'm sure that's part of what's happening here. But I read this sermon from Sarah Wilhelm Garber, um, talking about another possible interpretation of that or another dimension to taking off your sandals, which is that you would also take off your sandals when you came home, um, which could also be a sign of entering something sacred. I mean, your home is also a sacred place, but not the same sort of like, it creates an intimacy rather than a distance between God and Moses. If Moses is kind of being invited into home with God. So this passage from this sermon reads, in the ancient Near Eastern context, you would remove your sandals when you came home. I wonder about that. What does it mean if in this encounter of God, Moses, who has been wandering in wilderness, who has not been a fit or at home anywhere, first removed from his own family, brought up in another family, then he has to leave that place, and he's been wandering in the desert. He now comes to this place, and God shows up and says, you're home. This is sacred ground. Take off your shoes. Welcome, beloved. Live from that place now and lead my people into freedom. So here he encounters God, and God partners with Moses to then lead God's people to freedom. So I was really interested by that kind of interpretation of sacred ground and removing your shoes, of being welcomed into that closeness with God, that home with God,
Yes.
and then to be able to like from that place of security, like go out and do the work of liberation.
Wow. That's the intimacy that's kind of described there is significant. And I'm not even sure I'm having one of those moments where I'm like, I'm not even sure if I'm able to grasp the full kind of implications of what that means. Like the way that there is an invitation of it's not only potentially not only reverence, but like connection and intimacy and belonging.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. That's
Yeah, absolutely. There's it I I like that intimacy part as well because there's another rabbi, sorry, I'm going to quote a lot of rabbis today, Rabbi Baya is saying that it says remove your sandals, and it's not like a negative comment. It's not a comment of like, hey, you're doing it wrong. You should have removed your sandals already. This is holy ground. Shame on you. That's not what is happening there, according to Rabbi Baya. It says like, hey, you're missing out on the intimacy with God. These sandals are literally a barrier between you and God right now. So they go a little bit more in depth there, but I hear you, Peter. That intimacy is pretty cool.
that's so cool.
Yeah, I really
Um, I also saw you, Mishi, had a note that's just really interesting about kind of sandals versus gloves. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, sure. Because in at least my translation, I don't know what y'all's translation says. It says, "Don't come closer. Remove your sandals from your feet," which makes me chuckle. I'm like, from your feet? Where else are they on? But you should know that nothing in like in scripture or in the Torah is written without reason, at least not in these Torah scriptures. So if it says remove them from your feet, it means something. So when I dug into it, I realized, oh, that's funny because the na'alecha, the words that is used there is actually just means covering in essence. So you need to say covering of what? Covering of hands or feet, because in separate different passages, that same word means remove your gloves. So that was a small little notes.
I always love those little like notes of the original language and just the way that the language even works and gives context. Yeah, I love those. And I see Carolyn also said, love the idea of Moses being home, and that's going to linger in my mind for a while. A couple other comments in the chat. I like in the film Prince of Egypt, who the burning bush has both male and female voices. Yes, I think that is really, really powerful in the way that even just it sits kind of subtly in the. I love Prince of Egypt, by the way. I'm like, the soundtrack is amazing. So like the way that even the soundtrack has that kind of both masculine and feminine kind of thing sitting at there's like a high register that it sits in and it's kind of in the background in the chorus or the choir, I think. Yeah. And then I'm just seeing Carolyn's wondering like what is prescribed versus what we do on our own. I think that's regarding correct me if I'm wrong, Carolyn. I think that's regarding reverence and how we choose what we choose to do, what is told to us and what we choose to do. Yes. Well, on that note, I would kind of noting one question that I had was like, why do you think Moses was afraid, like specifically, and have you and like why does Moses like have that reaction, and have you ever had a similar experience yourself, or maybe not seeing a burning bush quite literally, but had a moment of like this profound experience of contact with the divine in some way that was like that affected you in that way? I don't know. What do you think? Because I definitely have, and I'm just curious if other people have.
I do want to note that it's must also be a translation thing because I'm reading it in Hebrew and I never read it like y'all read it. So I want to go after this, I want to reread everything again. When I read verse 3, I read that Moses is turning his face to look at the burning bush, and God says, "Hey, I'm here, I'm here," versus Moses turn his face away. So turn aside sounds to me like he's moving towards the bush to look at it, not to turn away. So now you and was it Caroline that said like that's super interesting. Now I want to reread this and like boom.
We may be looking at verse 6 though.
Yes. So in verse 6, yeah,
Got it.
where it says
Yes,
what
there
is
we go.
what is the Hebrew there? It says, and Moses hid his face for he was afraid to look at God. Is kind of the in verse 6. There
Like,
is
instead. Yeah.
because that is really curious that and that could be, you know, in terms of tradition and interpretation, right? So that of how that's interpreted.
That is it.
I'm just catching up here. Oh, and also Amory, I see your I missed this earlier. The Hebrew interlinear does mention that is a thorn bush. Carolyn said, very tangential now, but I'm reminded of VeggieTales episode where they wore shoes on their heads. That's great. Also, I kind of imagine Moses hiding his face with shame, like how Adam and Eve hid from God in the garden. Yeah. Tina says, most of the time in the Bible, when the angel or other heavenly messenger appears, the response is fear, in quotes, although it may be a translation issue for something that really means more like reverence. Yeah, and it is interesting to see, like, I would love to would love to spend a little bit more time. We probably could just do the entire thing on this one section, honestly, and just kind of really dive deep in this and figure it out. Maybe not figure it out, but kind of get a little bit deeper. But yeah, it is true. And for me, it's like just sharing a little bit for me is sometimes there's moments when I've had connections or felt like this sense of connection with God that have been both incredibly the sense of like connection and belonging. And that's why I love the idea of being home and this kind of intimacy of taking off sandals, but also have just been overwhelming in a sense of, can I even be here? Is this even something that I'm allowed to experience in this way? And so, yeah, definitely there's a lot there. And it can be just like an emotionally overwhelm, almost like a shock to the system that it's like, I don't know how to process it. And to me, when I read Moses kind of hiding face and turning away, that's kind of what I'm imagining. Um, and
Yeah,
it,
or
Yeah.
if we keep following that intimacy and closeness thread a little bit too, like just thinking about, I've definitely had those experiences of God like you're describing too, but even sometimes an experience of intimacy with another person or closeness with another person, sometimes I've felt that response of like fear or overwhelm, because it's so vulnerable and it's
yeah,
like opening
Yeah.
yourself up to connection in a new way can sometimes feel like, oh no, I don't know if I'm ready for this. Um, and then especially like Moses is about to be called into like this really difficult work also. So I wonder if that's part of it too. It's like
yeah,
you kind of sense that this is going to challenge you or this is going to lead you to places that aren't necessarily comfortable,
yeah,
and you have to kind of figure out whether you're ready for that.
yeah, totally.
He knew what was going to happen. He was like, uh-oh.
Yeah.
I've
What
heard
am I
these
going to
stories.
list? Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I'm seeing Amory, a couple comments here. I've been studying the religious experience of the sublime in aesthetic philosophy. The divine encounter can be overwhelming, awesome, and overpowering feeling. Yeah, absolutely. Um, well, as much as I would love to kind of sit here, we have a lot of passage to get through in the next 35 minutes. So
Oh,
I'm going to try to move us along. If you have more thoughts on this passage, feel free to, or like this section, feel free to keep putting them in the chat. Um, but why don't we go and move on to the next section, verses 7 through 12. And I can go ahead and read this one. I'm reading from the NRSV, the updated edition. Um, then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivitites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. Now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh, who will bring my people, the Israelites, or to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He said, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. I love this section. This is one of my favorite kind of moments. And one of the things that I see in this, just sharing right now, is this is such a core passage for liberation theologies. Um, and this is like one of the foundational passages. Obviously, the whole Exodus story, a lot of, but like this, as I have seen, I have heard the cries, I have felt the suffering, this idea that God embodies the suffering and like experiences suffering. Um, there is a term in liberation theologies known as talked about as the preferential option for the poor, and that God kind of meaning God stands on the side and when stands on the side of the oppressed and the poor and the marginalized. And I love the expression of God's character in this moment, and it just for me, yeah. What do you all see in this section?
I'm staring at Peter.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it feels moving to me in the same way, Micah, of kind of characterizing God as a person who listens to our cries, listens to our suffering and responds. Um, yeah, it feels helpful to revisit that, especially during times when we feel like we're not heard, you know, just to kind of return to that
Yeah.
that part of God's character.
Right. Yeah. I'm really trying to sit into that part of like standing with the oppressed, thinking about how God sees, right? How God constantly sees those who are oppressed. When I read this last month when we were doing, I was reminded very much of the story of Hagar, where Hagar was running away. And in the verses before Hagar was running away, nobody named Hagar by her name. They were just saying that woman, this woman, your slave girl, and stuff like that. Very insulting words, which I can imagine hurt a lot. And then she ran away, and God is like, Hagar. And every time I get to that passage, I cry because it's like, I am a person whose love language is I need to be seen. So that fact that God is calling her by her name after she's not just been physically abused, right? She's also not being acknowledged. And then boom, right away. And then Hagar says God is a God who sees. And that's
Mhm.
this story again, right? God is a God who sees, you know. They've been crying out to the Lord for 400 years. And here I am, after a couple of years of hardship, thinking, God, where are you? And why are you not showing up? I hope it's not going to take 400 years.
Yeah.
Listen. But yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I see Carolyn saying in the chat, building on what Mike and Melody is saying, I love the solidarity that God shows with suffering. What God what God says also reads like a psalm or maybe a response to all the lamentations God has heard. Yes, absolutely. I want to share a quote that I found, and this is from the Queer Bible Commentary, J. Michelson, on the chapter on Exodus. Um, Liberation theology assumes that the story of the liberation of the Israelites in Exodus is living proof of a God who cares about the poor and the oppressed. To do God's work is to work for the liberation of the poor and those who have not had the opportunity to speak for themselves. For queers, especially those living at the intersection of these vectors of oppression, Exodus has been a resource for all these reasons and more. The fight for liberation is ongoing, particularly for queer people in vulnerable communities, and the need for a wider intersectional approach to queer liberation has drawn many LGBTQ plus people to struggles beyond those which a narrower understanding of activism may embrace.
Mm.
So I love the kind of connection that the author makes there about God's side or like identification with the poor and the oppressed. And those of us that find ourselves in those spaces of oppression find hope in that. And then we are also called into fighting for liberation and freedom and justice for other people in an intersectional way. And so I really like that quote and I wanted to share it.
That's powerful.
Yeah. Does anyone have any other thoughts on this? Or on this section? Anything else that you wanted to add? Peter, I know that you also had a kind of a note or another kind of quote that you found around this idea of co-laboring or kind of working with God against oppression.
Yeah. Another passage from Sarah Wilhelm Garber's sermon, kind of similar to what you've been talking about this, being this call to be part of that liberation work. You know, God, like that's what God's calling Moses into. So she says, for indeed we are held in the love of the God who says, take off your sandals and stay a while, but don't just do that. Then put them back on and go down to people who are crying out and do the work in the neighborhood that I've called you to be. A people who midwife freedom, a people who are prophets of freedom, people who are mothers and daughters and sons and friends and neighbors who bear witness to that mountain of God's freedom. A people who say, I see that promised land. God's kingdom is coming. It's not yet, but I know it's real, and I want to live my life oriented to that mountain. Living from the place of the vision from the mountain is living from the place of being held in the I am, a place where we don't need to fear, but there's space enough for each of us.
That's so beautiful. I love the people who midwife freedom.
I was just
That
about
is
to
such an
say,
incredible
what?
phrase. It's
It's
it's a bringing forth, and like and as and but also too it's an assistance in the bringing forth, right? I have a friend who is a practicing midwife, and she always says that she doesn't deliver, like she's not delivering, she's like with walking with the person who's delivering, and so this there is a co-laboring that's happening here, and the image of midwifery is a really powerful one. Yeah,
Yeah,
oh,
yeah, I really
very
like.
active.
yeah,
Yep. Yeah, and the idea that we can like see the promised land from the mountain, and then we have to come down and like, you know, sort of be part of bringing each other there.
yeah. And Amory, I see your comments. I'm feeling a lot of conflicting feelings at this moment, given the contemporary situation in the Holy Land. There is so much suffering and oppression in the Promised Land. Yeah, and I hear that, and I hear kind of the tension that we're feeling, given the political and social realities of the day. Like it's a hard thing to sit in, and it's a reminder of like the call to justice, and that there are ways that it can be a hard thing to live out, and something that we must continue to fight for. And so yeah, I hear that confliction and that sense of like, oof, this is there's an embodied way that this is even playing out in a physical geographic locality, of what we're talking about. Well, any other thoughts on this section, either in the chat or from either you, Peter, or Mish? All right. Well, why don't we go ahead and feel free to, again, as always, feel free to continue to post about it in the chat. Why don't we go ahead and move on to the next couple verses? And for this, we're going to like look at specifically verses 13 and 15. Mish, would you like to read those?
Sure. So I'm reading from the JPS. Moses said to God, "When I come to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your father's house has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is God's name? And what shall I say to them?' And God said to Moses, 'Eheye asher eheye.'" I'm sorry, this is a Jewish Bible, so that's what it says there. Continuing, "Thus you shall say to the Israelite, 'Eheye sent me to you,' or 'I am.'" I think your translations will all say, "And God said to Moses, 'I am who I am.'" Continuing, "Thus you shall say to the Israelites, 'I am sent me to you.'" And God said further to Moses, "Thus shall you speak to the Israelites." Tetragrammaton, on which we will elaborate later. "The God of your father's house, and the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This shall be my name forever. This is my appellation for all eternity."
Well, appellation.
Let's go.
That's a great word. Thank you for sharing that and for reading that. I'm so glad that, as because as we're talking about this, I'm so glad that you were reading that, and we can talk about the God's name and these all these yeah, ideas. Mine does say I am who I am, and then this is instead of appellation, it says this is my title, is what the NRSV kind of
Yeah,
translated it as, which is yes, but I love the context of affiliation. That's a great word.
Mine
right.
says, "This is my name forever. This is how all generations will remember me."
Ooh,
Mm,
I like the remembering aspect
Yeah,
there.
which seems
yeah.
a little different than what yours both say. Also, I've got a footnote that, because mine does say "I am who I am" as well, but there's a footnote that says, "Or I will be who I will be." So the tense is in question apparently in the translation.
Yeah,
It's hard.
I'm curious about that, and in terms of like even the tense in the Hebrew. Yeah, mine also has the same footnote. I will be what I will be. And I like that kind of, there's a I am and continuing to be. There's a continue continuity that's at play. Um, and yeah, Mish, I know you had some thoughts on kind of. It's interesting because my in the NRSV UE, the update edition, it says the heading for this section is the divine name revealed. And so I know you have some thoughts on kind of the difference in understanding about what is the divine name. And yeah, would you like to share what your thoughts on that?
Sure, sure. Because the question right away is like, what is the divine name? Is it I am who I am, or the four letters that so Jews don't pronounce God's name? That's a different conversation. So for now, I just will say God or Tetragrammaton, which we laughed about before the stream started, because Tetragrammaton definitely sounds like a buddy to Optimus Prime. But just saying, just saying. Yes, the divine revelation, but like the reason why I brought it up is because there's this common misunderstanding that Yud Hey Vav Hey, so the four letters that consist of God's name, that means I am who I am, but that's not true. One is in verse 14 and one is in verse 15. So and it's also true about what you say about the translation of I am who I am. So it first depends on the case. So if it's a call or a nifal, in this case, it's a call. So it means something to come to pass in the most simple sentence. So any of those is fine. So what you become essentially. So I am, but then in the sense of becoming it. So yeah, I guess that's why they put the footnotes. What did your footnote say again? I will become what
I will be. Let's see. I will be who I will be.
There you go. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, both of them could work. Both of them could work. But yeah, the problem is that's I have noticed within Christianity that sometimes it is thoughts, especially in worship songs.
The great I
that
am, or like the
I am is
yeah.
God's name, but that's not God's name. If anything, I think God is being sassy and is like, what are you talking about? I am who I am. I said you, but if you really want something, and then it's not even significant that God's name is being named according to the Jewish sages. So Tetragrammaton, even though that's officially God's name, is still not significant. What is significant is the entire thing, right? So that it says, "I am the God of your father's house." So of Abram, Isaac, and Jacob, very patriarchal language, but it kind of like encompasses that entire thing, which really speaks to me. It's like, no, I'm the familiar God. I'm the same God that your parents worshipped, and their parents and their parents. So that's kind of like the note that I put in our document. Behind the scenes of TMC, we have a secret document.
I'm really curious, Misha, like when you talk about like this is not God revealing God's true name in your understanding. Like, is God revealing something about themselves here that's true and new in some way, or is a form of like revelation or connection to Moses? Because I think I have always sort of understood it that way. Like, even though one name can't encompass all of who God is like revealing themselves in some way here, something true about them in order to, like, again, like become closer to Moses and to God's people. Does that still kind of track with how you understand this passage?
Yeah. And again, I mean, you can already see it in the ambiguity with your footnotes, is that there is no clear consensus about what exactly is happening. What I just said and how I interpret it is just like one of the many ways to interpret it. I just like the idea of a sassy God. So you got to take that with a really big grain of salt right there. Like, I am who I am. What are you talking about, right? But that's nothing to say, like, because for other people, that entire segment could be seen as God's revelation, because Moses is clearly asking God a serious question, and maybe God is not being sassy at all and takes it very serious. No, the existence of who I am is the existence of who I am. This is who I am, and this is who I shall be named forever. This entire thing, including my name, including that I'm the God of your forefathers, that shall be my title forever. So I just because I like sassy God, doesn't mean that I don't like the other interpretations either. And that's the hard parts, but also the cool part about any.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's,
I
oh, sorry,
like,
Peter.
go ahead.
I think that's a really powerful thing to think about is in terms of as we're thinking about interpretation, and I think you're bringing up a really interesting thing, Mish, just even how we're talking about this. I think a lot of times historical Christian interpretation sometimes moves in we need the one definitive answer and the one definitive way to understand what is happening in this moment. And where I think in a lot of Jewish midrashic and like interpretation, there's a little bit more openness in terms of and debate. And the debate is part of the wrestling of let's figure out together and like work at this together. And I love that. And I love that kind of embodied experience there of there is some this is confusing. Like, what is God even doing here? Like, I don't.
Yeah.
It's.
Yeah.
I love that kind of let's wrestle with God in understanding God more, and I feel like there's an invitation in that. And I also really like your kind of interpretation of sassy God. That's just a fun image. Like, and I mean, I think if you look at God's character, there is a lot of sass in a lot of things that God says. Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to look at the chat, but go for it really, really quickly. What were you going to say?
Yeah, no. I just wanted to affirm what you said about Jewish tradition with how I grew up in the culture shock with not just American Christianity, but Christianity in general, where things have to be absolutes. And like that text that we just talked about the sandals, literally, if I look through my commentaries, the two commentaries that are literally in the same book of commentaries, they're not like two different editions. They have been put in the same book. It's like one says no, take off your sandals means because Moses was being a bad boy, and the other one says no, take off your sandals because you need to experience the intimacy of God. And then there's no third opinion and says, obviously, opinion B was better than A. They just leave it there. And that's constantly the case within Judaism.
Yeah, it's such a different, and I see Amory said there's a very different approach to biblical hermeneutics in Christian and as well, especially Protestantism, versus Catholicism. Yeah, I think, and this is something as we're thinking about, as we're building spiritual community together, is what does that look like for us? Like, how do we approach these different ways of interpreting scripture? How do we hold that as a plurality? And what does that mean? And I think I like that we're able to do that here. Also, just noting that there's a lot of conversation about the idea of time and how time is being represented here. The sense of the eternal tense. Amory's interlinear says, I shall become who I am becoming. Ooh, there's like an active nature to that. Carolyn says, I'm kind of wondering about how to perceive time in this context. Like viewing time literally doesn't seem accurate here. Yeah. Amory says the present progressive tense. And Carolyn says, I like how God's continuity is established and how God witnessed Moses's ancestors suffering and will witness descendant suffering. Oh, that's a really powerful thing of connecting what immediately came before it is the revelation of I am the God of your ancestors, and I'm also witnessing the suffering of your people and my people, and there is a continuity there. That's really powerful. Yes. Any other thoughts here? I know, Peter, you had a couple of thoughts on, as we're kind of moving to close this section, on like the idea of the significance of a true name or the significance of knowing someone's name.
Well, I'm noticing too, like this, that was sort of what I was thinking about initially in including this this quote, but it's also, this quote also has a lot to do with how names are relational. How we use different names for ourselves in different spaces that represent often the relationship we have to the people we're speaking with. So I think like all the ways that we've been talking about how this might be understood in terms of what God is communicating, maybe kind of apply here. Like, you know, whatever God's true name is, there's something that God is trying to communicate relationally here with Moses in how they're talking about themselves. So this quote is from a reflection by Reed Carlson on Working Preacher. And it says, names usually demonstrate a relationship. Pastor, mama, daughter, darling, and soon doctor are all names that refer to my spouse. They signal her accomplishments, yes, but more fundamentally, they are used in the context of her relationships, each of which has a history and a dynamic present. Reflective of our relationships, we are given names at birth, but our names inevitably change as we grow. Names can also be oppressive. In the Bible, giving someone a new name can be evidence of a special calling, but also a sign of subjugation and humiliation. For these reasons and others, names might change not because we have become something new, but because we wish for them to reflect better who we have always been, as when someone changes their name to indicate their ethnicity or when a trans person transitions. Names are not inconsequential for human beings because our relationships are not inconsequential. To the extent that having a relationship with God matters, it does matter to know God's name.
Yeah.
So yeah, just thinking about that, yeah, like the way God is communicating God's name here is about the relationship that God is expressing with Moses and with God's people.
Yeah, I
And
love that. It also it opens up the possibility of God to have a plurality of name, right? Like we know that that there's different names that people have given God or that God has revealed to individuals. And I love the idea of relationship. Yeah, even thinking about, for example, brought up Hagar earlier, who said, you are El Roi, like the God who sees. Like that kind of idea of that relationship, that is a very personal thing of God seeing, and that's a relationship. Really cool. Yeah, looking in the chat again. Speaking of a sassy God, I am reminded of the episode of American Dad where Stan meets God, and God goes on I have to, so you know more than me when Stan says God needs to save his family. Oh yeah, I'm not super familiar with American Dad, but that does sound like a potential sassy God moment. And then Amory says God as the ground of all being, the God who is called by many names. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in the last 10-ish minutes, why don't we move to finish up the last section here? Peter, would you like to read kind of through the end, verses 16 through 22?
Sure. Go and get Israel's elders together and say to them, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me. The Lord said, I've been paying close attention to you and to what has been done to you in Egypt. I've decided to take you away from the harassment in Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land full of milk and honey. They will accept what you say to them. Then you and Israel's elders will go to Egypt's king and say to him, the Lord, the Hebrews' God, has met with us. So now let us go on a 3-day journey into the desert so that we can offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. However, I know that Egypt's king won't let you go unless he's forced to do it. So I'll use my strength and hit Egypt with dramatic displays of my power. After that, he'll let you go. I'll make it so that when you leave Egypt, the Egyptians will be kind to you and you won't go away empty-handed. Every woman will ask her neighbor, along with the immigrant in her household, for their silver and their gold jewelry, as well as their clothing. Then you will put it on your sons and daughters, and you will rob the Egyptians.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, I think there's so much here. I think we could probably spend another talking about an entire other time in Bible Study Live just unpacking this, because there's a lot in here. But does anyone have any kind of thoughts? I know Mishu had some thoughts on the plagues or some questions about the mention, I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders. That's how That's how the NRSV translates it with all my wonders. But if we read a little ahead in the story, it's plagues, and that's complicated. So
Yes, yes. It's funny now you say. So yours says wonders. I mean, it is wonders, but we know that it's plagues. It's funny. Niflatai. That's what the Hebrew says that, which comes from Pele, not the soccer player. Although, I mean, that was a miracle, I guess. But yes, that means miracle, like specifically miracle. So it's like I perform miracles. I'm like, okay, that's interesting. Um, yeah, no, this is where stuff gets really uncomfortable because this it is hard for me to, on one hand, see that there is this liberation in God seeing the oppressed, and then knowing what will come, that then oppression will be done to others, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if I'm using the correct terms here, but that's how it feels. It's something we can see through history where people who've been oppressed then turn around and oppress other people consistently, right? And this is one of those moments, like God thinking about sassy God again. It's like, oh, I got plans. All you gotta do is you gotta tell them I'm gonna go into the desert for 3 days, but what you're really gonna do is rob them. And it's like, so there's this whole plan playing out, which is kind of funny, but then it turns into not funny anymore. And I have always struggled with him ever since I read this in Torah classes when I was a little kid.
yeah, it's a complex thing, especially God standing on the side of the oppressed. But lib- how quickly a people who was once formerly oppressed can find freedom and then turn and flip that and oppress others, and thinking about where the exodus goes and the ways that the Canaanites are wiped out. And I think and just there's the Egyptians are going to experience all these plagues and the death of the firstborn, and like
It's pretty hefty,
it's
right?
a lot, it's heavy. um
Yeah.
and it's
And
worth
then,
sitting with, I think.
yeah, exactly. Because this is the note that you're probably referring to in our secret document. It's like, it doesn't look like a lesson. There seems to be a different meaning to this because if this was a lesson, that's a very heavy-handed lesson.
Yeah.
Like all plagues combined, that's pretty hefty to just give a lesson. And then there's also, of course, we know the hardening of God, of Pharaoh's heart. Yeah, it's rough. But on the positive side, you wrote a note that I also noticed a little bit earlier. You want to talk about that, about hearing Moses's voice?
Yeah. I do want to note that Carolyn says, fun, barely related fact. For my first Halloween, my parents dressed my twin and I as frogs to be a plague of frogs for a biblical costume party.
Yeah.
That is incredible. Amory also said, I once had to write a paper on the genocide of the Canaanites. How do we reconcile these? Yeah, absolutely. And it's worth sitting with the tension, because I think if we just are really quickly to think about how much victory it is, that's how we end up in kind of like oppressive, like we can justify oppressing others because God is on our side. Like we have to sit with the tension. Um,
Victor.
Carolyn also says, read the oppression and turning around. I always think of Jonah and what happened when the oppressors immediately repented and how Nineveh wasn't destroyed. Yeah, absolutely. There's another connection there.
Yeah.
Yeah, just like quickly on the kind of the thing that this isn't directly mentioned in this passage, but we find out from I think it's the following chapter, in chapter 4, that Moses is like, why are you choosing me? I can't speak well. Like there's like Moses, and the scholars think that Moses potentially had a speech impediment. And there is ways that I have found some different disability activists and different disability theologians looking at Moses through the lens of disability, and seeing this as like a potential lisp or a stutter, and how like when in verse 18, God says, they will listen to your voice. And if we know that Moses probably was written as having a stutter or a speech impediment, how would you imagine that might have impacted him? Like to hear God saying they will listen to your voice. And so that's a really, I think that's a really powerful thing. And what can that look like, and what models does that have for people, like for disability theology, and kind of where we can explore that. Um, well, I know we could go on for a really long time, and maybe we'll have to come back at some point to some of these other points, or maybe we can go to chapter 4 and look at Moses's response and kind of how Moses even starts to debate with God about whether or not Moses is going to go.
So,
Maybe we can look at that in the future. And then really quickly as we close, just noting that Carolyn says, I love Moses as a disability rep. And Amory says, I've seen that we do the same thing in the LGBT community. For example, gay people, marginalizing trans people, etc. Yeah, it was like the idea of when you get free, then you become like this idea or the idea of passing as like when you're able to pass, and then you become part of the oppressors, and then you don't fight or advocate for the people who are still experiencing oppression. Yes, and Carolyn, and how God gives Moses an accommodation with Aaron to speak to. There's a really powerful thing, so maybe we're going to have to come back here. There's a really powerful thing of God saying to Moses, Aaron will be like, Aaron will be your prophet, and you will be like God to him. So there's a way of God even taking identity with Moses as a person with a disability. There's a really powerful like parallels there. So yeah, I think we're gonna have to come back to this. We'll come back in a future Bible study live. Well, in closing, before we continue and talk all night, what are kind of some of your kind of takeaways or final kind of key things that you're taking away from this? For me, this passage, again, as I said, one of my favorite parts is God seeing the oppression and standing with the oppressed. And this passage for me, I think there's a core part for me that God sees and stands in solidarity with the plight of the oppressed. And there is that, obviously, there is that tension that we have to hold there too, of God doesn't, like, of holding that kind of the tension of the genocide and the plagues in alongside with that. But there is this encouragement and hope that I see in this passage from God's solidarity with the oppressed.
Yeah, for me, I keep coming back to that idea of God desiring closeness with us and intimacy with us, and the ways that's expressed in this passage. And then also how that's kind of the foundation for us to then go out and become part of that work of liberation. It starts there, and then from that place of home, that place of closeness and intimacy, we can go out and do that work.
Mm-hmm. Mish, do you have any kind of closing thoughts?
Yeah, that's maybe that's a discomfort that we feel about turning around and oppressing others is the example that we should take out of this. Maybe the people who have witnessed these stories and wrote these down into these stories that we are reading right now misinterpreted it and did exactly that thing. Oh, because God was on our side, we have all the rights to oppress other people. So maybe it is a beautiful story that was skewed into we have victory. And if that's the case, how interesting is it that we are reading it's even at a further degree and what that means. So I'm just enjoying, maybe enjoying is not the right word, but I'm liking to sit in that ambiguity of like, yeah, no, definitely not okay with it. It's just definitely not okay with that. But what is the lesson here? And what if they witnessed it and just wrote it down in a way that is not so cool.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you all. And thank you out to everyone who joined us in the chat. Thank you for all the wonderful conversation and comments. It was a really good conversation and really good Bible study live. So thank you for all of your participation. Before we close, one quick announcement. Next week, on the 20th, we will actually be holding on the YouTube channel, we're going to be holding a Christmas worship service. So there's still, if you would like to participate and you're part of our community, part of our Discord community, especially, you can go. There's a link on the Discord where you can submit videos for Christmas carols. We're doing carols and also a scripture reading. So you can find more information on the worship planning channel in the Discord. And we're extending the deadline to this Friday. So if you would like to be part of it, you still have a little bit of time to submit a video. And thank you to everyone who's already submitted videos. That will be here on next Wednesday at the same time, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and we'll see you soon.
Yay.